Chapter 961. Pei Chi-Chi's voice was soft. Tang Yu, isn't it good for you to be the CEO? I want to return the shares and the office to you. It's so tiring. Tang Yu was a seat away from her. Seeing her like this, he smiled and said, Aren't you doing well? She looked at him suspiciously. Do you have other plans? Could it be that he wanted to go home and be a nanny? In the future, she would be the one earning money for the milk powder? Pei Chi-Chi screamed, I don't want it. Tang Yu stroked his chin and smiled. Chi-Chi, I didn't say I want it. But if you really want it, I can cooperate. But are you sure you want to be here? His eyes swept left and right, hinting at her. Pei Chi-Chi glared at him. He was shameless. He knew that wasn't what she meant. Tang Yu smiled. Chi-Chi, in 6 months, after you take over Jean Taihe, I will take over Bo Yi. Jean Taihe? Pei Chi-Chi was stunned. Tang Yu, Chi-Chi, Shen Zhongshan might not be able to hold on for that long. Although he found out in time after Shen Lian drugged him, his brain might shrink in the end. Tang Yu stared at her, his eyes dark. He didn't know how she would react, but he felt that he was being cruel. She had thought that after helping Shen Zhongshan get Jean Taihe, she would be able to stay out of it and leave Jean Taihe behind. But if it was that simple, Shen Zhongshan wouldn't need her help. From the beginning, Shen Zhongshan had wanted her to take over Jean Taihe. Now, Bowie would be her internship. Tang Yu didn't do anything, but it didn't mean that he didn't care. But so far, his Chi-Chi was great. Pei Chi-Chi was stunned after hearing Tang Yu's words. She hadn't expected the truth to be like this. She thought that Shen Zhongshan only hated Shen Lian and wanted to take back the Shen family. Even if the 20% was given to her, she didn't want it. He had helped Shen Zhongshan because he had wanted to be a match for Tang Xian, but after helping her, she no longer wanted to be Shen Zhongshan's daughter. But now, Tang Yu said that Shen Zhongshan might be suffering from brain atrophy. At this moment, what Pei Chi-Chi didn't know was that Shen Zhongshan had already signed a consent form for the operation while he was still in good condition. This was so that if there was a problem with her body in the future, he would risk his life to save her. Mrs. Shen knew and agreed. No matter what decision Shen Zhongshan made, she would agree. Regardless of life or death, she would follow him. In the past, she loved him deeply. He did not know. Now that he had become like this, she still loved him deeply. He understood, and was willing to repay her. Pei Chi-Chi and Tang Xian were Chongshan's children. Now that Shen Lian had become like that, there was no hope for her. Whatever Chongshan decided, it was up to him. Mrs. Shen was grateful that Chongshan did not give up on Shen Lian. Instead, he sent her abroad. Perhaps she would be able to calm down there. At this moment, Pei Chi-Chi was in a daze. After a long time, she regained her composure and looked at Tang Yu. There was even a trace of fear in her eyes. She had lost too much. Shen Zhongshan and she did not have much feelings for each other, just like Zhao Ke. Or perhaps not like Zhao Ke, because she did not have a mother, and Pei Mingyi made up for her father's shortcomings. But now, hearing this news, she was still sad. Chapter 962. Would Pei Mingyi's condition worsen in the future? Would he not even be able to hear her call him little sister? Pei Chi-Chi's body trembled slightly. Suddenly, she left her seat and walked to Tang Yu's back to hug him. She did not say anything and only hugged him from behind. She wanted to feel his warmth. She buried her face in his neck and said in a soft voice like a lamb, Tang Yu. Even if she did not say it, he knew what she was thinking. She was afraid and insecure. He hugged her back and said as if he was coaxing a child, Chi-Chi, I'm here. I've always been here. She was sullen and did not speak. She buried her face in his neck and closed her eyes, not saying a word. What's wrong? His voice was unbelievably gentle. At that moment, the person hugging him was not Boss Pei but his Chi-Chi, that fragile little girl. Pei Chi-Chi bit his ear. Tang Yu's body went numb. His eyes darkened and his voice was unbelievably hoarse. Chi-Chi, you're tempting me to commit a crime. She lay on his shoulder and did not speak for a long time. She just bit him. She was like a puppy biting its owner. He thought that she would not answer, but Pei Chi-Chi said softly, Tang Yu, do you want to commit a crime? His body froze completely. He narrowed his eyes and straightened his body. His voice was even hoarser. Chi-Chi, are you sure? She had to bear the consequences of teasing a man who had not had sex for half a month. Pei Chi-Chi nibbled on his neck and let out a soft "n." He could not take it anymore. He carried her from behind and placed her on the spacious conference table. She was a little uneasy. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his chest. She called out like a kitten, "Tang Yu, be good. I'm here." He kissed her little neck and comforted her. When she slowly relaxed, he pushed her toward the wooden desk with one hand. She was lying on the huge desk. Her back was cold, and in front of her was his burning gaze. She felt very hot and ashamed. She closed her eyes, and her body was gently trembling for the upcoming sex. "Open your eyes." He leaned over and supported himself with one hand to prevent himself from pressing on her. He kissed her little mouth coaxingly. "Chi-Chi, I want you to see how we are together." Her body was still trembling slightly. She closed her eyes and trembled helplessly. He raised his hand and resolutely, one by one, removed all of her. She was a little regretful and afraid. At this moment, she was weak both physically and mentally. "Tang Yu." She called his name softly, and there was a trace of moisture in her eyes. "I'm scared." She was afraid of losing it, so she held on to it with all her might. Her long hair was spread on the dark logs, and her body was tender like a newborn baby. Tang Yu looked at her like this. His body was hot, but his heart was calm. He kissed her as if he had a lifetime to do this. She was afraid, so he hugged her and kept coaxing her. He kept telling her, "It's okay." He told her, "Chi-Chi, I'm here." He did not know what he touched, but the bright lights in the conference room dimmed. In that dimness, her vulnerability and his gaze became eternal. In her trembling, they became one. In the slow and ancient melody, it slowly told of love and his deep feelings. "Pei Chi-Chi, you are my constant expectation." Chapter 963. In the afternoon, Pei Chi-Chi went to a place that she thought she would never go to in her life. Shan and Mrs. Shun's residence. Tang Yu accompanied her there. He drove with one hand and held her hand with the other. His palm was warm, not as cold as hers. Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips. After his car stopped, she said softly, "Tang Yu, let's go back." After all, Mrs. Shun was there. She didn't think it was a good idea. Tang Yu interlocked his fingers with hers and smiled. "Why did you change your mind?" Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips and said after a long time, "I'm afraid that Mrs. Shun will be unhappy. Also, she would deal with Shan Lian later." It wasn't a good idea to go there now. Tang Yu reached out and touched her little head. "Don't think too much. It's just a private visit." Pei Chi-Chi nodded. She was very obedient, which reminded Tang Yu of someone, Pei Huan. Recently, he had seen Pei Huan and Lao Can a few times. Pei Huan was like this in front of Lao Kansas. Had his Chi-Chi reflected on herself? Did she think that girls should be gentler? Thinking of her cold attitude towards him before, Tang Yu's heart was a little cold. He opened the car door and patted her little hand. "Don't stay there. Get out. Be good." She nodded again and got out of the car with him. Tang Yu took out a gift box from the trunk and gave it to Mrs. Shun to nourish her body. As far as he knew, Mrs. Shun did not have a good life in the past few days. Her mental state was not very good, and most of the Shin family's finances were in Shan Lian's hands. The servants were also slowly reduced, and everything was done by Mrs. Shun, including taking care of Shun Zhongshan. Pei Chi-Chi's mood now was the same as Tang Xian's when she met Lin Yun. She was a little scared. Tang Yu almost knocked on the door with his little lamb. He had to prevent her from running away. Pei Chi-Chi stared at him with resentment in her eyes. Tang Yu knocked on the door and waited for a minute before the door opened. It was Mrs. Shun who opened the door. When her slightly aged eyes looked at Pei Chi-Chi, many emotions flashed through them. Pei Chi-Chi bit her lip and called her Annie softly. In the past, her mother, Zhao Ku, was Shin Zhongshan's third son who had been raised outside. Zhao Ku's existence had deeply hurt Mrs. Shun's feelings, so it was impossible for her to act as if nothing had happened. If it was the Mrs. Shun of the past, she would definitely not be able to remain calm. However, in the past 2 years, she had already calmed down a lot. She only hoped that Shin Zhongshan would be safe, and that Shun Lian would turn over a new leaf. Mrs. Shun looked at Pei Chi-Chi for a long time before saying softly, "Come in." Pei Chi-Chi grabbed Tang Yu's arm, her fingers almost digging into his flesh. Tang Yu looked at her with a smile that wasn't a smile, then put his arm around her shoulders and walked in. Shin Zhongshan was sitting on the sofa drinking tea. His eyes were clear, but his body was still fat. He wouldn't be able to change it in a short period of time. "Uncle Shun." Tang Yu stood in front of Shin Zhongshan and smiled faintly. Shin Zhongshan looked up at the young man in front of him with admiration in his eyes. No matter what, Tang Yu was always extremely calm. On the contrary, his good-for-nothing daughter was far from being a match for him. Tang Yu's patience was enough to defeat all the advantages that Shun Lian had. At this point, it wasn't strange that Shun Lian had spat out 20% of Sheng Yuan's power. Shin Zhongshan responded with a grunt, then shifted his gaze to his little daughter. Chapter 964. Everything was actually his fault. What did it have to do with her? Shin Zhongshan instructed Mrs. Shun, "Sushin, go and pour 2 cups of tea for the Dahong Pao I've kept for years." Then he paused and smiled helplessly. "Look at my memory. I've already moved here. There's no Dahong Pao." But Mrs. Shun still magically came over. When they were moving, as long as it was something that he loved, she would move over with him. Shin Zhongshan was extremely touched. Mrs. Shun put down the tea. She probably knew that the atmosphere here was strange, and it wasn't convenient for them to talk, so she found an excuse to go to the bedroom. When she left, not only Pei Chi-Chi, but Shun Zhongshan was also relieved. After all, it was already very good for Sushin to be like this. He couldn't make things difficult for her anymore. Pei Chi-Chi and Tang Yu sat down under Shun Zhongshan's gesture. Tang Yu reached out and touched her little head. "Chi-Chi, you drank the tea and didn't greet anyone?" Pei Chi-Chi tilted her head and looked at him. There was a touch of sadness in her eyes. Why was he always against her today? But Tang Yu only chuckled and stroked her hair again. Pei Chi-Chi had no choice but to softly call out to Uncle Shin. Shin Zhongshan's eyebrows twitched. He would be lying if he said he wasn't disappointed. Pei Chi-Chi was the daughter he liked the most. Compared to Tang Xian, he liked Pei Chi-Chi even more. As for Shun Lian, it was needless to say. Just based on what she had done, it was already good enough to keep her alive. Tang Yu looked at Pei Chi-Chi. "Huh?" Pei Chi-Chi's little hand secretly pinched his thigh. He was so bad. Tang Yu acted as though he couldn't feel the pain. He smiled and looked at her. Pei Chi-Chi had no choice but to softly call out, "Daddy." Her voice was so soft that only her lips could be seen moving, but to Shin Zhongshan, this was already the ultimate salvation. At this moment, he didn't have any resentment towards Zhao Ku and became peaceful. He didn't respond. He just looked at Pei Chi-Chi with the gentle gaze of a loving father. Pei Chi-Chi was uncomfortable. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't, because there might not be many opportunities like this. Shin Zhongshan's brain was injured. No one could guarantee how many times he could be awake. Her gaze was a bit distressed. Shin Zhongshan could guess what the little girl was thinking. He sighed slightly and then changed his expression. He said to Tang Yu with a bit of a brisk tone, "Bring the chessboard over. I haven't played in a long time. My hands are stuffy." Tang Yu with a smile. He took it and the two played seriously. The two played seriously. Chi-Chi Tang Yu. With Pei was with him. With Pei with him. With Pei. The intimacy of the young couple made Shin Zhongshan smile. He and Su Xian didn't seem to have such a good time. When he was young, he was addicted to Zhao Ke's body for a long time. He was very gentle to her. But this gentleness was only because of her body and not his heart. Shin Zhongshan put down the chess piece and said calmly, "Chi-Chi, go to the kitchen and cut a plate of fruit. Your Aunt Shun just bought a honeydew melon this morning. It's quite sweet." Pei Chi-Chi looked up and looked at Shin Zhongshan in surprise. Then, she stood up mechanically and went to the kitchen to cut the honeydew melon. In the simple living room, Shin Zhongshan played chess while talking to Tang Yu. "This girl is quite obedient. Is she usually like this?" Tang Yu grinned. "I'm obedient most of the time." Chapter 965. Shin Zhongshan smiled and didn't say anything else. Pei Chi came out with fruits and placed them between them. Tang Yu took a piece while Xin Zhongshan didn't move. Pei Chi looked at him. You've been pretending to be crazy for 2 years. I'm about to puke from eating too much. Xin Zhongshan said calmly. Pei Chi looked at his figure and thought that he probably cared a lot about his figure. She didn't force it and took a small piece herself. After playing chess for half a day, Mrs. Shin came out and said that she was going to cook and asked them to stay for dinner. Pei Chi didn't dare to. Mrs. Shun just smiled and went to the kitchen. Xin Zhongshan continued to play chess calmly and said calmly, "If you can help, help your aunt." Xin Zhongshan said, "Your aunt comes from a good family and lived a good life after marriage. I'm afraid the food she cooks won't taste good. Just make do with it." Thinking about it, Su Exine had suffered a lot. Although he had a lot of money on hand, it was good to have a simple life. At least he was on a diet. Pei Chi nodded and said instinctively, "Then I'll go help." Tang Yu put down a piece and looked in the direction of the kitchen. He said to Shun Zhongshan, "Chi-Chi's cooking is good." Xin Zhongshan looked over and saw Pei Chi talking to Mrs. Shun. Her little face seemed to be trying to please her. It was quite heart-wrenching. Xin Zhongshan looked at her and his eyes became hot. This child was like him. She could be gentle and strong. He smiled with satisfaction. "My daughter, how could she be wrong?" Tang Yu continued to play chess with him. He was also absent-minded. The two men played while paying attention to the movements in the kitchen. On the other side, Mrs. Shun wanted to escape from the kitchen. She was so old, but she was defeated by a young girl in her early 20s. Look at how she cut the vegetables. The stir-frying looked and smelled good, and the thick soup was so fragrant that she wanted to drink 2 bowls. Mrs. Shun hadn't had a decent meal in a long time since all the servants in the family had been laid off. Now that she smelled it and looked at it, she was so touched that she wanted to cry. Pei Chi looked at her and swallowed hard. After Mrs. Shun's excitement, she calmed down and became very indifferent. "All right, tell your father and Tang Yu to wash their hands and eat." Pei Chi replied with an "oh" and went to call someone. Then, she came back to help Mrs. Shun serve the dishes. Mrs. Shun felt a little emotional in her heart. Zhaoke's child was not bad. He was even more considerate than her own daughter. At the thought of Shan Lian, she felt suffocated in her heart and her expression softened a little. However, when Mrs. Shun saw the dishes on the table, Chong Shan sat there and smiled. Mrs. Shun's heart was instantly healed. Xin Zhongshan was very happy. He had not drunk for a long time. In fact, he could not drink. So he asked Mrs. Shun to open a bottle of red wine for Tang Yu. Pei Chi did not touch it. She had to drive for Tang Yu later. Xin Zhongshan was very happy. For the first time, he ate an extra bowl of rice. Mrs. Shun was very ashamed, so she ate 2 more bowls. Tang Yu noticed it all along. He glanced at his little Chi-Chi and felt very proud. Pei Chi looked at the 2 Shuns. Weren't they rich? Why were they acting like African refugees now? Mrs. Shun was a little embarrassed. She scooped another bowl of rice, but before she could eat, she looked at the last bowl of soup. It was not bad to use it to make rice. Chapter 966. Mrs. Shun's face froze as she looked at Xin Zhongshan. Xin Zhongshan spat out the food in his mouth, and it flowed down the corner of his mouth. It looked dirty and messy, and his expression turned blank. Definitely an Oscar-level acting. Just then, the door opened and Shan Lian walked in. She stood at the door and looked at the people inside. Her gaze slowly shifted to the dining table. It looked very sumptuous. Even though they were almost done eating, they looked happy and harmonious. Xin Lian placed her bag at the entrance and looked at them. She scoffed coldly. "Why didn't you call me for a family reunion? Isn't my surname Shen?" Xin Zhongshan was still chewing the food in his mouth mechanically. His mouth opened and closed. Miss is here." Xin Lian walked over slowly and sat beside Shan Zhongshan. Her voice was gentle. "Dad, let me feed you, okay? Look, you're eating everywhere. Is it because my mom didn't take good care of you?" With that said, she looked up at Mrs. Shun and smiled strangely. "Mom, go back with Dad. I'll take good care of you." Mrs. Shun's voice was stern. "What do you want? Your father and I will not go back. You should give up on this idea." Xin Lian looked around and chuckled. "Look, living in a place like this, you haven't bought anything for 2 years. Is this an extra meal today? Mom, are you sure you want to bring my dad to live like this? Shun Lian's eyes were cold. Mrs. Shun was so angry that her entire body was trembling. She glared at Shun Lian. You bastard. You harmed your dad and now you're doing such a disgraceful thing. Shun Lian scoffed coldly. Mom, you can eat whatever you want, but you can't say whatever you want. Mrs. Shin pointed at her and almost fainted. Pei Chi-Chi was about to speak when Tang Yu tugged at her, gesturing for her not to say anything. He stood up, looked at Shin Lian, and smiled faintly. I wanted to visit Uncle Shin and Aunt Shan. They are indeed suffering. But Shun Lian, where have you been for the past 2 years? Shun Lian narrowed her eyes and glared at Tang Yu. Tang Yu continued, just now, you said that we shouldn't talk nonsense, right? Shun Lian raised her head. Yes. Does Mr. Tang have any advice for me? Tang Yu looked at her and said, it's true that we don't have any evidence that you gave Uncle Shun that kind of medicine. At that time, Auntie Shin didn't sue you because of the relationship between the two of you. But Shun Lian, the difference between humans and animals is human nature. What you've done in the past 2 years is practically inhumane. What right do you have to criticize me? Do you have any proof? Shun Lian sneered. In fact, her heart was trembling. Tang Yu must have known something for him to act like this. Sure enough, Tang Yu's gaze was deep, and he smiled faintly. Shun Lian, what you did to Uncle Shun in the hospital was recorded by the surveillance camera. Chapter 967. Because her pampered mother would never be able to cook such delicious food. Pei Chi-Chi, what do you want now? You snatched away Tang Yu and my shares. Now, you want to lie to my parents and take away Jean Taiha? Shun Lian glared at Pei Chi-Chi, her eyes filled with hatred. Pei Chi-Chi's eyes were filled with hatred. If not for Pei Chi-Chi's appearance, everything would have been fine. Even if Tang Yu didn't love her, even if he couldn't touch her, he couldn't touch anyone else. But you appeared. You took away everything that belonged to me and made me so miserable. Shun Lian turned to Tang Yu. And you set up a car accident and took away my leg. Ha ha ha, I'm a useless person now, so you don't want me, right? Mrs. Shun's eyes were filled with confusion. She had never known what Shun Lian was talking about. Tang Yu was still very calm. Just like what you said just now, you can't talk nonsense. Shun Lian, things without any evidence are slander. Shun Lian raised her head. I'm not as clever as you. To be able to lie to me for 2 years and get this bastard back. To think that she could still love you so much after having an abortion. Tang Yu, I admit defeat. Tang Yu's eyes darkened. Pei Chi-Chi held his hand, silently calming his anger. Finally, he said coldly, I will take Uncle Shun and Auntie Shin away. Shun Lian, you're on your own. Shun Lian was stunned. Then she looked at Mrs. Shun. Mom, you're leaving with him? With someone who has nothing to do with you? Look carefully. Pei Chi-Chi is Zhao Ke's daughter. Have you forgotten the past? Have you forgotten how Shin Zhongshan treated us? Mrs. Shin looked at her hysterical expression and said calmly, I'll leave with Tang Yu. Shun Lian, stop. Shun Lian was stunned for a while before she murmured, Mom, you don't want me anymore? You want to be Pei Chi-Chi's mother, don't you? Are you going to be snatched away by her too? She pulled the tablecloth off the table, and the dishes fell to the ground with a crash. Some of the shards flew and cut her leg. It was painful, and blood flowed down. But Mrs. Shun was unmoved. She looked at her beloved daughter and said firmly, Yes. Mrs. Shun smiled bitterly and refused to talk to her anymore. Otherwise, your father's life will be in your hands. Shun Lian was beyond saving. Mrs. Shun told Tang Yu to look after Shin Zhongshan and went to the bedroom to pack. Actually, it was just clothes. She had gotten used to living a simple life for the past 2 years and didn't need any fancy clothes or jewelry. She packed a large suitcase and dragged it outside. Pei Chi-Chi had already wiped the corner of Shun Zhongshan's mouth clean. Mrs. Shin looked at Shun Lian again and said calmly, Take care of yourself in the future. Shun Lian asked in a daze, Mom, are you going to cut ties with me? If so, will you repent? Mrs. Shun closed her eyes, hoping for the last time. But Shun Lian laughed softly. Her laughter was extremely mournful. Mom, are you joking? You want me to repent? What did I do wrong? It's clearly all of you who let me down. Mrs. Shun's heart was cold. She opened her eyes again and supported Shun Zhongshan calmly. Zhongshan, let's go. Shun Zhongshan followed her obediently. Tang Yu helped them pack their luggage, and Pei Qiqi followed. Chapter 968. Before Mrs. Shun left, she looked back at the house, which held her best and most painful memories. Shun Lian was still standing there, murmuring, "Mom." Mrs. Shun just looked at her deeply, turned around, and left. The door closed. The bright lights in the room, the mess on the floor, and Shun Lian stood there alone. Shun Lian stood there, looking as lonely as a child. Her world was an isolated island, and she was a bird on the island. She couldn't even find a place to rest. Tears fell from her delicate face, but she didn't wipe them away. She just said softly, "You want me to turn back? You want me to stop? But I can't turn back. I can't stop. I can't accept it. Everything I have was taken away by Pei Qiqi." Shun Lian laughed softly. Looking at the scattered food on the floor, she murmured, "How long have I been eating alone? I've always been alone." She picked up the bottle of red wine and poured it into her mouth. Then she opened another bottle and drank as much as she could. It was good to be drunk. When she was drunk, she didn't have to think about what she had lost. But the sobriety she had when she was drunk was the most fatal. She began to sing, scream, and say crazy things. She began to smash things in the house, smashing everything that could be smashed. After smashing, everything would be fine, and there would be nothing left. Everything would be clean. The neighbor called the police. An hour later, Shun Lian was taken away by the police and taken to the hospital for a breathalyzer test. Shun Lian was still drunk. She screamed and cried. Her face was full of tears and snot. The police couldn't do anything to her, because as soon as they touched Shun Lian, she would scream. After about 2 hours, Shun Lian was not as crazy as before. She lay there, murmuring Zhang Hengyuan's name. "Is he your boyfriend?" The police didn't recognize Mr. Shun from Jin Taihe in B City and asked helplessly. At this time, a hospital staff recognized Shun Lian. "Oh, Dr. Zhang is her attending doctor." But, he. The police officer thought about it. "This person is very unstable. Why don't we call Dr. Zhang over?" The young nurse chuckled a few more times before she slowly said, "Dr. Zhang resigned because of his work style." The policeman was quite disappointed. How could this be? Doctors nowadays are all like this. The young nurse was not afraid of trouble. She mumbled, "Dr. Zhang's character is very good. Wasn't he seduced by her?" After having a good time, she took off her pants and said that Dr. Zhang's medical ethics are bad. If Dr. Zhang isn't a good doctor, there won't be any good doctors. It just so happened that the police had brought along an accompanying official reporter who happened to record this scene. Next to them, Shun Lian was shouting Zhang Hengyuan's name loudly. All kinds of words revealed that the two sides had an improper relationship. The young nurse was also shrewish and knew how to stir up trouble. Everyone in the hospital felt indignant for Dr. Zhang. There were so many young and beautiful female doctors and nurses in the hospital. Was there a need for Dr. Zhang to deceive a woman who was missing a leg and resign voluntarily? He clearly liked her, but was this kind of love worth it? The young nurse felt very indignant. She took out her phone and called Zhang Hengyuan. "Dr. Zhang, Shun Lian is making a scene in the hospital. Do you want to come and take a look?" It was a good opportunity to expose. Was Dr. Zhang pestering Shun Lian? Or was it Shun Lian pestering Dr. Zhang and then throwing him away after using him? Chapter 969. From the elevator to the consultation room, it was packed with people. The nurses on duty, doctors, and even the patients were watching the commotion. Shun Lian's identity was also exposed. Everyone was shocked. How could such a rich woman be so crazy? It turned out that rich people had their own troubles. It was not as glamorous as it seemed on the outside. Zhang Hengyuan looked solemn. He had one hand in his pocket. He was wearing a pair of trousers, a white knitted shirt, and a black windbreaker. When he walked over, the police officer was very polite. "Are you Miss Shun's attending doctor?" Zhang Hengyuan replied calmly, I'm not a doctor anymore. I'm here in my private capacity. As he said that, he looked at the nurse who was on the phone. The nurse immediately hid. The police officer smiled. Someone called the police and said that Miss Shun was a nuisance. We saw that she was drunk and brought her here. Nothing serious happened. Just be careful in the future. After all, she's a celebrity and it's not good. Dr. Zhang, when she sobers up, just give us an explanation. Zhang Hengyuan nodded. Okay, I will. Then, he paid the fine. Before the police left, he looked at the crowd. Disperse. Protect the privacy of others. After saying that, he left. The people who were watching the commotion also dispersed. Xunlian was lying on the examination table. Her long, curly hair spread out on the white pillow, revealing her angelic face. However, Zhang Hengyuan had already experienced that she had a devil's heart. He was still standing and said calmly, If you're awake, go and wash your face. I'll send you back. Xunlian did not move. Her voice was very soft. Hengyuan, I know you won't leave me alone. If he had not experienced it before, he would really think that she was sincere. However, how could Xunlian be sincere? Her sincerity was all for hatred. Zhang Hengyuan's expression was still very calm, but it showed his forbearance. Consider it over. This is the last time I care about you. In the past, he had been to her. No matter who she loved in her heart, no matter how much she had in the past, no matter how broken she was, as long as she was willing, he would be there. He was at fault for the absurdity of that night, but her viciousness had hurt him. At first, he thought that he would at least be a friend of hers. However, after sleeping with her once, he realized that she only treated him as a tool that could be used anywhere. After using him, she could discard him. His feelings were not important to her at all. At that time, his masculine pride was ruthlessly trampled by her. Xunlian's eyes were blurred. I don't believe it. I don't believe that you won't care about me. I know you love me, don't you? There are some things that can't be supported by feelings. Xunlian, I can only choose to give up. Zhang Hengyuan's hands were still in his pockets. I'll be going to Canada next month. I might be immigrating and won't be coming back. He looked at her dazed expression and turned to call a nurse over. Get her a ward. I'll settle the bill tomorrow. With that, he turned around to leave. Xunlian was stunned. She sat up and screamed at his back. Why didn't you take me away? I want to go home with you. The young nurses were eavesdropping and looked at him in disdain. Zhang Hengyuan stopped, but he did not look back. His voice was a little hoarse. I won't sleep with you again. Xunlian, last time was our second time. The first time was when you were drunk at the bar. You must have forgotten about it. Telling her could be considered a kind of closure, and also an explanation for this absurd secret love of his. Chapter 970. On the other side, Tang Yu arranged for Shun Zhongshan and Mrs. Shun to stay in a villa in the suburbs. There was a temporary guard at the door, so that Xunlian could not harass them anymore. Mrs. Shun was very grateful, but when they left, she wanted to say something but hesitated. It was not convenient for Pei Qiqi, so Tang Yu had to step in. He let Pei Qiqi get in the car first, looked at Mrs. Shun, and said slowly, Uncle Shen said that he would send her abroad. I will respect his decision. Mrs. Shun was in tears. Finally, Chongshan still cared about their father-daughter relationship, but Xunlian kept making mistakes. Seeing that Mrs. Shun was crying, Tang Yu took a tissue and said, Aunt Shun, don't be too sad. Mrs. Shun was sobbing. In the end, it was Shun Zhongshan who brought her upstairs. Tang Yu went outside, opened the door, and got in the car. When he was fastening the seatbelt, Pei Qiqi came over and whispered, I think I heard Aunt Shin crying. He nodded and fastened the seatbelt. Then, he raised his hand and rubbed her hair. He smiled and said, Mrs. Shan has had a hard time in the past 2 years. Qiqi, you don't mind, do you? Pei Qiqi was stunned and asked him subconsciously, What do you mind? Tang Yu looked at her for a while, touched his head, but did not say anything. Instead, he started the car. Pei Qiqi saw that he was driving in the direction of the rose garden. She put her hand on the back of his hand and said, How are we going there? Pei Qiqi, we are going to make love now. Do you want to do it in the car instead of going home? Mr. Tang looked very natural, as if he was buying cabbage on the street. She was stunned, and then her breathing was a little chaotic. She stammered, "Who wants to do it with you?" She was too embarrassed to say that word. Tang Yu patted her little hand and said happily, "Pei Chi, I'm not going to do it with you," she denied very seriously. Tang Yu drove with one hand and paid attention to the situation in front of him. He took the time to tease his little pet. "Pei Chi, do you dare to say that you don't want to do it with me? So tell me, who do you want to do it with?" He was truly shameless. Pei Chi did not utter a single word. She turned her face away and looked out of the window. In the end, she even wound down the window to cool herself down. Her face was too hot. Tang Yu smiled, his voice low and hoarse. "What if I say, Xiaoxin is also there?" Pei Chi turned her head abruptly and looked at him in disbelief. She softly called out, "Tang Yu, will you now?" He asked briskly. Pei Chi hugged his arm and said sweetly, "Tang Yu, you're the best." Mr. Tang was still serious. "Pei Chi, let's talk about this tonight." Pei Chi did not understand his words at first, but she understood at night. It was a painful realization. The car slowly drove into the rose garden. Chapter 971. Although he had gotten married and had children in the past 2 years, he had not changed this habit before going to bed. This put a lot of pressure on Zhao. In fact, he was not interested in this Buddhist scripture at all. When he talked to her before, it was only because she liked it. After getting married, it was more. Sometimes, he desired his wife's body, but after taking a shower, he felt guilty when he saw the Buddhist scriptures in his wife's hands. He wondered if he was too sensual. At this moment, the 2 babies were sleeping beside her. They were very cute. Pei Chi looked at them from the side. She wanted to carry Xiaoxin to her room immediately, but she did not dare to act rashly by Lin Yun's side. At the same time, under the dim yellow light, she saw that Lin Yun's brows were a little tired. She felt guilty and grateful. Lin Yun was in her 50s, and it was difficult for her to take care of 2 children. Moreover, Xiaoxin was born prematurely, and her body was very weak. Pei Chi's heart softened. She squatted down and looked at the 2 babies. They were both white and chubby. They were both very well. She looked up and held Lin Yun's calf. She said softly, "Mom, thank you." Lin Yun put down the Buddhist scriptures in her hands and smiled. "Silly child, there's no need to thank me." Her fingers stroked the young girl's black hair. Her eyes were bright and beautiful. She was only in her early 20s. The more she looked at her, the better she looked, let alone her son. Pei Chi looked at the 2 fat little dumplings. The 2 babies' breaths had a milky smell. Her heart was extremely soft. She also softened her voice. "They are so cute." Lin Yun smiled. "If Xiaoxin is not my granddaughter, it would be a good match." Pei Chi did not expect Lin Yun to make such a joke. She was stunned for a moment. Lin Yun smiled. "Do you want to carry Xiaoxin upstairs?" "Okay." This was what Pei Chi said. "No." This was what Tang Yu said. Lin Yun unconsciously looked at her son and shook her head. How could she not know her son? He usually looked very serious, but he had no integrity at the crucial moment. Today, he invited her as a guest, presumably with bad intentions. Look, the little girl was tricked into coming back. Tang Yu probably knew what his mother was thinking. He coughed lightly and said, "Mom, I won't wake Xiaoxin up. Let's see tomorrow morning. Good night." As he spoke, he held Pei Chi's hand and walked out. Actually, Pei Chi was a little resistant. She still wanted to carry Xiaoxin upstairs to sleep with them, but at this time, Tang Yu couldn't bear it anymore. He quickened his steps, opened the door, and closed it. "Tang Yu." Pei Chi was a little annoyed and called him lightly, but just as she cried out, her little face was cupped by him, and her body was pressed against the heavy door. His lips covered her little mouth, and it only took him a second to pry it open. She shook her little head, her eyes shimmering with tears under the dim light, looking pitiful. But the more fragile she was, the more it aroused his desire to conquer her. He pressed her against the door, squeezed her long legs in the middle, and just a lift was enough to torture her. She would rather die than live. Being kissed so intensely by him. His big palms also trembled. She bloomed in his palms, her little mouth moaned, but she did not dare to struggle with all her might. Lin Yun and the two babies were sleeping on the other side of the door. Chapter 972. He looked at her flirtatious expression and pinched her chin gently. Let's go back to the bedroom, okay? Pei Chi shook her head and whimpered, no. But when she said no, he leaned forward and said slowly, Chi, keep your voice down later. Her eyes widened as he started to unbutton his shirt with one hand. She closed her eyes in fear and screamed, no. Luckily, he covered her mouth in time so that Lin Yun couldn't hear her. Tang Yu didn't say anything but just stared at her with his clear eyes. Pei Chi bit her lip and looked at him helplessly. Then, she broke free from his hand and hugged his neck obediently. She said softly, let's go back to the room. He smiled, reached out to pick up his little girl, and walked towards their bedroom. The short time in the conference room during the day really couldn't comfort him. He carried her to the balcony of the bedroom and turned on the night light. The light was dense and the atmosphere was warm. He pressed her against the sofa and kissed her. She fell onto the sofa and he slowly lowered his body. As they kissed, they took off each other's clothes. Soon, they fell to the ground. Just as the arrow was knocked on the bowstring, an unknown creature came over and covered Tang Yu's eyes with its little hand. It called out Daddy in a crisp voice. Tang Yu closed his eyes and cursed softly. And when Pei Chi opened her blurry eyes, she saw Shao Qi at the Marvel conference. Why was Shao Qi here? The robot, Shao Qi, also looked at Pei Chi in confusion. Who was this? Why was she in her and Daddy's bedroom? Almost at the same time, Pei Chi 7 and Shao Qi said together, why is she here? Tang Yu was still leaning on Pei Chi, his voice husky. He didn't want Shao Qi to see what she shouldn't see. Even if she was just a robot, it was better not to teach children bad things like this. Also, damn it, why didn't anyone tell him that Manager Lin had repaired Little Seven and sent him back? He even let Shao Qi see him and Pei Chi making love. I need your explanation. Pei Chi and Shao Qi spoke at the same time. After saying that, Pei Chi stared at the robot, a little shocked that the robot's thinking was exactly the same as hers. No matter how accurate the data was, it was impossible to achieve this because the human brain was so complex and Marvel's chip was so terrifying. She was frightened, but at the same time, she was angry. Even though Shao Qi was imitating her, it wasn't her. She wanted to ask what Tang Yu had done with Shao Qi, but before she could, Shao Qi said, before you, Daddy always hugged me to sleep. Pei Chi gritted her teeth and glared at Tang Yu. Really? Tang Yu closed his eyes and rubbed against her again reluctantly. His face was buried in her neck, and the tip of his slightly cold nose touched her delicate skin. Chi, don't care about the child. He wanted to continue, but Pei Chi pushed him away. Shameless. She used her clothes to cover herself, and Shao Qi stared straight at Daddy's body. Her brain was doing precise calculations. Daddy was 30% longer than the average length of a human. Long live Daddy. Daddy was amazing. Tang Yu was helpless. He turned around and switched off Shao Qi's power. Chapter 973. Tang Yu coughed lightly. She's just a kid. Pei Chi leaned against the sofa and looked at him. She said that you hugged her to sleep. Tang Yu smiled. How is that possible? He propped himself up, kissed her and coaxed her. You can't believe a kid's words. She accepted his kiss and said in a cold voice, but I feel that a kid's words are the truest, not to mention a robot that doesn't have any ulterior motives. She hugged his neck with her little hands and breathed out. Tang Yu, have you ever done it with her? Tang Yu's expression became extremely uncomfortable, and he bit her little lips seductively. Silly, how could I? Little Chi didn't do it either. Here, here, and here. His finger pointed at every place he said. Pei Chi couldn't stand it at all. She gritted her teeth and looked at him. He was really too shameless. Pei Chi bit her lip and stared at him. The moisture in her eyes almost made him drown in it. He moved closer to her ear and said in a very low voice, Chi, are you jealous? Of course not. She snorted and turned her face to the side. His lips touched hers gently, and he asked again, Chi-Chi? She didn't say a word and looked at him as if she was looking at a pervert. Tang Yu smiled and nibbled her little shoulder. His voice was low and husky. I promise I didn't do it with little Chi-Chi. How about it? He paused for a moment and smiled even more wantonly. Chi-Chi, do you want to check? Before she could react, he took her little hand and walked over. Pei Chi-Chi was embarrassed and angry. He was shameless. She stared at him with tears in her eyes while he kissed her little face and comforted her. The night was cold. On the balcony, he was passionate as he pestered her again and again. Early in the morning, when Pei Chi-Chi woke up, there was a fat little guy lying on her. Big sister, the little guy spat out a mouthful of saliva and climbed up from her waist. His speed was super fast, just like the little guy in the cartoon. Pei Chi-Chi grabbed onto that chubby little arm. When she opened her mouth, her voice was a little hoarse. Has the baby eaten? Baby has eaten, but Grandma hasn't drunk, Xiaoxin said, looking at her longingly. Pei Chi-Chi was lying on the big bed with her clothes unbuttoned. She cautiously pulled up her clothes and turned her head. She was surprised to see that Tang Yu had not woken up either. Probably knowing what she was thinking, Tang Yu smiled and said, Pei Chi-Chi, I'm exhausted. She stuffed the little boy into his arms. Xiaoxin's heart should be broken. He leaned against the headboard and let Xiaoxin sit on his stomach. He chuckled. I think this habit of hers is quite good. As he said that, he actually reached out and felt it. He smiled and said, Don't you feel like, well, it feels better? This was all thanks to Xiaoxin. As a father, he kissed Xiaoxin's little face as a reward. Pei Chi-Chi felt a chill and was ready to get up to brush her teeth and wash her face. With Lin Yun around, she always felt that it was not good to sleep in. However, she had only moved a little when Tang Yu reached out and pulled her back into his arms. Lie down for a while more. Pei Chi-Chi was about to speak when her phone rang. She took a look at it and saw that it was Pei Huan calling. She looked at Tang Yu and picked up the phone. Her body also propped up a little. Pei Huan's unhappy voice was on the other side of the phone. Chi-Chi, didn't you say that you would accompany me to try on a wedding dress? Only then did Pei Chi-Chi remember that Pei Huan had mentioned it to her 2 days ago, but she had forgotten it. Chapter 974. Pei Chi-Chi glanced at him. In fact, she was also hesitant because she didn't want to give up Xiaoxin. They hadn't seen each other for a long time, and they didn't spend much time together last night. But Pei Huan begged, Chi-Chi, I'm here, but Laocan is still on the way. Come with me. Think about it. An unmarried and pregnant girl feels so helpless and pitiful at this time. Pei Chi-Chi was speechless and gave her a blow. You're a young woman who lost her marriage, and soon you'll be a woman again. Pei Huan cried. Pei Chi-Chi, you're so annoying. But Pei Huan, you're quite cute when you're angry. Pei Chi-Chi chuckled and looked at Tang Yu's slightly gloomy eyes. I'll be there in a while. She thought about it. Pei Huan had no relatives now, and marrying Laocan might be Pei Huan's last marriage. She'd better accompany her. After hanging up the phone, Tang Yu naturally objected, and Xiaoxin refused to let go of her. Okay, Xiaoxin, I'll come again next time. She kissed the chubby little girl and returned her to Tang Yu. Although Tang Yu was resentful, he still stood up. I'll take you there. Pei Chi-Chi held him down. I'll ask Lao Zhao to take me there. You stay with Mom. She looked straight at him, calm and indifferent. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at the hand she placed on the back of his hand. He smiled and said, All right then. He leaned over and kissed her. If I'm free at noon, I'll pick you up for lunch. She nodded and got up to tidy herself up. When she went out, she said goodbye to Lin Yun. Lin Yun was a little surprised to hear that Pei Huan was going to get married, but she also gave her blessings. It was already 10:30 when Pei Chi-Chi arrived at the wedding photography studio designated by Pei Huan. Pei Huan had already changed into a wedding dress. She looked at Pei Chi-Chi in the mirror. How is it? Pretty good. Pei Chi-Chi noticed that Pei Huan's belly seemed to be flat. Pei Huan looked around and was also satisfied, mainly because this dress was chosen for her by her husband. However, thinking of Laocan, she was dissatisfied and complained, I have to attend an activity this morning. I said I would be there at 10 o'clock, but now, I'm not here yet. Just then, the door was pushed open, and Lao Can rushed over. His forehead was full of sweat in late autumn, and his voice was hoarse. I'm here. Pei Huan's face showed a touch of shyness. That's right. Pei Chichi was already used to the two of them acting all day long. She sat on the sofa to read a magazine and listen to the commotion. Oldkin came over. Pei Huan hadn't seen him for 2 hours, so she naturally kissed him for a while. Pei Chichi really felt that it was nauseating. Oldkin, such a mighty man, had actually become sentimental like Pei Huan. After kissing for a while, Lao Can went to wash his face and change into a formal suit. He and Pei Huan were a perfect couple. Pei Chichi was in charge of helping Pei Chichi straighten her skirt and tidy up her clothes. Pei Huan was a little princess now, and she insisted that Pei Chichi serve her, saying that she was pregnant. Xiaomei couldn't stand it anymore. Fortunately, Pei Chichi had a good temper, and she followed the noble pregnant woman's wishes. The photographers were all in position, and the pregnant woman said in a coquettish voice, Lao Can, take 2 photos for me and the baby later. Pei Chichi rolled her eyes. She was afraid that the whole world wouldn't know she was pregnant. Chapter 975. Xiaomei was holding the phone for him. She looked at it with a complicated expression. It's Suimo. Pei Huan was unhappy. She fiddled with her skirt. It's old eye. Hurry up and pick it up. Don't forget to tell her that we're getting married. Let her be a part of it. Oldkin was embarrassed in front of these people, so he coughed. We'll talk about it when we get back. Look at you. You're already pregnant, but you're still so bad-tempered. Of course, I'm not as understanding as your Suimo, Pei Huan said sourly. She walked over to the sofa angrily. I'm not taking any more photos. Oldkin had been with her for a long time. He knew that Pei Huan had a bad mouth, but she wasn't that unreasonable. He smiled and picked up the phone while looking at his future wife. However, his expression changed as he listened to her. It even became very ugly. The voice on the other end was very loud. He could hear Suimo crying and screaming. Pei Huan's body tensed up and she sat up straight. Oldkin gripped his phone tightly and slowly scrolled down. He exuded an aura of horror, which was quite frightening to look at. He looked at Pei Huan and said softly, Suimo is in danger. I have to go. Pei Huan was stunned. She then said sternly, Can Mingzhu, today is the day we take our wedding photos. Oldkin's expression was still very tense. She's in danger. I have to go. As he said that, he untied his bow tie and threw it aside. Then, he picked up his car keys and walked out. He could still hear Sumo's screams and cries of pain. That was the sound of pain that could only come from being raped, because he didn't want to remember. The man's rough panting. Pei Huan cried. She stood there and called Can Mingzhu's name again. He left just like that, without even a word of comfort. Even if he said that they would continue filming when he came back and that their wedding would not change, she would feel a little more at ease. Also, had it ever occurred to him that she, as his wife, would be worried if he went alone like this? He did not think about any of that. At that moment, there was only Suimo in his heart. There was only his moonlight. Pei Huan closed her eyes and bit her lips. She did not say a word. However, his lower abdomen slowly started to hurt, and it started to hurt intermittently. She called out Oldkin's name hoarsely. She closed her eyes, which were filled with pain. Lao Can had already walked to the door. When he heard Pei Huan's voice, he turned around and saw her pained expression. Can Mingzhu, my stomach hurts? Take me to the hospital, Pei Huan said in a hoarse voice as she held her stomach. Pei Chichi was also frightened. She and Little Mei supported her on both sides, and felt that Pei Huan's body was ice-cold. A strand of fresh blood dyed her skirt red, making Pei Huan's face even paler. She looked at Old Can and smiled gently. Can Mingzhu, you should go. If you go, our wedding will be cancelled, regardless of whether we can keep this child or not. Her body was trembling. She never knew that there would be such pain. This was far more painful than the pain that Jinrong had given her. Pei Huan shed tears as she looked at the man she fell in love with. She had thought that she had found someone to rely on for the rest of her life. But now, she was facing a miscarriage, and her man was still hesitating whether to save his first love first. She stared at Lao Kan stubbornly, wanting him to make the decision. Chapter 976. Old Kan, what are you waiting for? You won't be able to keep the child if you keep dragging this on. Pei Chi sounded anxious. Why was he still hesitating at a time like this? No matter how important Sue Mo was she more important than the child? Did he not want Pei Huan anymore? Did he not want children anymore? At this moment, Pei Chi's heart ached for Pei Huan. Old Kan's eyes were bloodshot. It wasn't that he didn't care about Pei Huan, but Sue Mo was being treated like that by a few men. He was a man, and he couldn't ignore her. In the end, he gritted his teeth. Chi, take Pei Huan to the hospital. Pei Huan closed her eyes and said nothing. Old Kan, are you crazy? Pei Chi's eyes were also filled with tears. Old Kan pursed his lips. Please. He quickly walked out and didn't dare to look at Pei Huan. He was afraid to see the disappointment in her eyes and the despair she had for him. I'm sorry. In the future, I will spend the rest of my life taking care of you and our child. Pei Chi and Lil Mei didn't delay any longer and helped him into Lil Mei's car. Pei Huan sat in the car. Her wedding dress was stained with blood, and it was also stained all over the car. Xiao Mei had been a manager for a long time, and she was used to the disputes and grudges in the industry. She was already numb to it. At this moment, her eyes were a little hot, and she felt bad for Pei Huan. Everyone knew that this might be Pei Huan's last chance to be a mother. As Xiao Mei drove, Pei Chi hugged Pei Huan and comforted her. It's fine. Pei Huan, think about the child. Nothing will happen. Pei Huan closed her eyes in pain. At this moment, the pain in her body was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. It wasn't that she couldn't understand why he wanted to save Sue Mo, but her life and the child's life weren't as important as Sue Mo's. Pei Huan kept her eyes closed and tears flowed down her cheeks. She held onto Pei Chi's arm tightly, almost digging into her flesh. After a moment of pain, Pei Huan screamed, "Sister." Pei Chi burst into tears. Pei Huan had never properly called her big sister before. How painful was her heart at this moment. She hugged Pei Huan tightly and kept telling her that it would be fine. She called Tang Yu and asked him to bring Dr. Mei to City General Hospital because it was the nearest hospital. Covered in blood, Pei Huan was sent to the emergency room. She looked at Pei Chi listlessly, unwilling to let go. His lips were unbelievably pale, and his voice was intermittent. Sister, until now, I can't bear to part with this child. I don't want to abort it. Pei Huan didn't say that she would take care of the child herself. Pei Chi had grown up with her, so how could she not understand her feelings at this time? Pei Huan smiled and held back her to cry. Pei Tu to say. Pei Tu for Chi, Pei to saying Huan to Chi. Pei was to saying you, I, you, to you. Chi you. You. Have to say. Chi you me, I you. Chi you. I you. I. From now on, I only have you. Pei Chi stood in the aisle while Tang Yu stood on the other side. He slowly walked towards her. Pei Chi hugged his waist and said in a hoarse voice, Tang Yu, if you have to choose between me and the child one day, please choose the child. Chapter 977. Tang Yu patted her head and comforted her. Don't worry about Dr. Mei's medical skills. She nodded in his arms and then shook her head vigorously. At this moment, her phone rang. It was a voice changer from an unknown number. Pei Chi, you must be in a lot of pain right now, right? I heard that Pei Huan had a miscarriage and was hospitalized. That's a pity. Do you know where Kan Mingzhu went? Pei Chi gritted her teeth. She knew that it was Shun Lian. The voice on the other side of the phone continued. Didn't Pei Huan say that my man is disgusting? Then, I'll find someone even more disgusting to rape Suemo. Look, Pei Huan's man is heartbroken. He's going to save Suemo even if he doesn't want her. Speaking of which, I've long disliked Suimo. I'm really happy now. Especially when I see you in pain and crying. I'm even happier. A creepy laughter came from the other side of the phone. Then, the laughter stopped abruptly. Pei Chi gritted her teeth. It was Shun Lian. She was going to make her pay back double. She waited for a long time, but Laucan didn't show up because he was comforting Suimo. Pei Chi didn't know Suimo well, but she knew that women like Suimo had their ways after being around for a long time. At this moment, her reputation might be ruined, and Laucan was her last hope. Whether it was in reality or in love, Laucan was the best home for her. But that wasn't what Pei Chi was worried about, because Pei Huan wouldn't want Laucan anymore. However, she didn't expect that Laucan would only show up at the hospital the next day. In between, he only called to ask about Pei Huan and the child. In Pei Chi's heart, it was probably because the white moonlight in his heart was more important. Pei Huan should give up now. 2 hours later, Dr. Mei came out first. She let out a long sigh and said, "That was close. The child is fine, but she has to take good care of the baby. Otherwise, she won't be able to keep the child." Pei Chi breathed a sigh of relief. Tang Yu reached out to hold her and asked for her. "How long will it take to see him?" "Half an hour will be enough. Just don't provoke her." Dr. May's voice was a little low. "I know the director here. I'll just inform him." As he spoke, he sighed. "She looks quite pitiful." "Oh, right. Where's her boyfriend?" The last time they saw each other, they were so lovey-dovey. It had been so long. Even if they had come from the moon, they should have rushed back. Pei Chi pursed her lips and did not say anything. Dr. May was also an experienced person, so she only sighed. Later, when he saw Pei Huan, she was already asleep. When he woke up, it was already 8 o'clock in the evening. Pei Chi had been sitting and watching over him. Tang Yu went back at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and just came over. He brought Pei Chi's food and Pei Huan's tonic soup. Pei Chi was quite touched. Chapter 978. Pei Huan smiled. "I used to naively think that I was pregnant, that I loved him wholeheartedly, and that the child and I were everything to him. If nothing had happened to the child and he had gone to save Suimo, she would still be angry when he came back. But as long as he was willing to coax her, she would understand and forgive him. But she was bleeding at the time." Pei Huan's tears came out again. She reached out to wipe them away gently, but she felt tired every time she lifted her head. She laughed self-deprecatingly. "Chi, look at my tears. They're like free tap water." Pei Chi wiped her tears with a tissue. "Don't cry. It's not good for the child." "Child?" Pei Huan caressed her stomach gently. She hadn't expected the child to be saved, but it had nothing to do with Qin Mingzhu anymore. She suddenly closed her eyes. "Chi, if he comes, tell him I don't want to see him." Pei Chi was stunned. Although she was angry and thought that Pei Huan wouldn't want Oldkin anymore, the child was still alive. She still hoped that they could get back together, but it seemed impossible now. But Oldkin still couldn't come. He only called in the middle of the night and hung up after knowing that the child was fine. He didn't explain anything. Pei Chi heard a weak cry on the other end. It was Sumo's voice. They were still together. But Old Can and Pei Huan didn't expect fate to be so coincidental. Suimo and Pei Huan were staying in the same hospital. Pei Chi almost wanted to smash her phone. She didn't dare let Pei Huan know that she had picked up the call outside. Pei Huan had finally fallen asleep. However, she did not know that Pei Huan had already woken up when her phone rang. She remembered that Old Can's ringtone on Chi-Chi's phone was special, and it could be recognized immediately. Pei Huan's tears rolled down. She finally gave up. Pei Chi returned to the ward. She wanted to see Pei Huan, but she saw that her face was covered in tears. Pei Huan didn't cry. She turned to look at Pei Chi and said calmly, "Chi, I'm done with him. Don't worry about me. I'll live a good life in the future and pretend that I've never met this man." She chuckled softly. "In the future, I will help my child find a good father." Pei Chi was sad, but Pei Huan comforted her. "It's okay, Chi. What's so good about Qin Mingzhu? He's old, not handsome, and has no money. Other than being good in bed, He doesn't have any good points. Every time she said something, Pei Chi would agree with her. As they talked, they both laughed and cried. Yes, it was no big deal. They would raise the child together and find a good father in the future. Finally, Pei Huan fell asleep again, but Pei Chi could not fall asleep. There was something she had to do. Early in the morning, Shun Lian walked into the company hall in a rare good mood. However, she heard a voice behind her that she could recognize even if she was reduced to ashes. Shun Lian turned around. Pei Chi stood there, dressed in black, like a messenger of vengeance from hell. There were a few elite people behind her, and more importantly, there were 4 bodyguards. Shun Lian instinctively called for security. Pei Chi looked at her and chuckled. Jean Tai's management is not good enough. I can't even see a single security guard. Did you send all of them to rape others? Shun Lian calmed down slowly. They were in public. What could Pei Chi do to her? She sneered. Why? Are you here to avenge Su Mo or Pei Huan? Save it, Pei Chi. Can Mingzhu is now with Su Mo, and they can't be separated. Your good-for-nothing sister is probably going to become an unwed mother. Pei Chi looked calm. Is that so? But I'm curious, if you lose everything, will you still be so arrogant? Chapter 979. Shun Lian's face was filled with panic. Her pupils constricted, and she immediately opened the document. She did not believe that there was such a will in the world, but it did exist. She threw the document on the floor, and Shun Lian raised her head. I won't admit it. My father has lost his mind. These are fake. Whether it's real or not, the judicial department will verify it. Pei Chi looked at her coldly. Shun Lian, now that we're done with business, let's talk about private matters. Shun Lian took a step back and looked at Pei Chi warily. What are you trying to do? Pei Chi stepped forward and she stepped back. Shun Lian waved her hands wildly. What are you trying to do, Pei Chi? Are you crazy? This is Jean Taiha, the property of the Shin family, and you're just a bastard. What right do you have to behave atrociously on my land? She even raised her hand and aimed it at Pei Chi, wanting to slap her. However, Pei Chi grabbed Shun Lian's hand and gave her a backhand slap. Shun Lian's face swelled up. She used all her strength in that slap. Even Pei Chi's hand hurt. Before Shun Lian could react, Pei Chi slapped her again. This time, it was on the other side of her face. Jean Taiha's office hall was filled with exclamations. Many employees took a few steps back. God, their president Shun had been slapped by someone, and it was in his territory. No one dared to step forward to stop Pei Chi's momentum. She looked at Shun Lian and said coldly, these 2 slaps, one is for Tang Exine, and the other is for Pei Huan. Shun Lian, in the future, don't even think about hurting the people around me. If you hurt them once, I can guarantee that you will pay back double. Shun Lian wanted to raise her hand, but the people behind Pei Chi stepped forward and held her down. Shun Lian couldn't move. Pei Chi went forward and looked at her expressionlessly. Are you in pain? You know pain, but don't you feel pain when you hurt them? Shun Lian chuckled. Pei Chi, I'm in pain, but aren't you in more pain than me? Pei Huan's matter has touched your nerves, hasn't it? You lost your child too. And Tang Exine, you have no idea how pitiful she looked when she died. She was so skinny. It's a pity. You couldn't see it. You lunatic. Pei Chi slapped her again. You're a lunatic who wouldn't even let her own father off. Also, Pei Chi didn't like Su Mo, because at this time, Su Mo still had evil intentions towards a pregnant woman and wanted to snatch Can Mingzhu away. But Su Mo's life was indeed ruined by Shun Lian. Shun Lian was so cruel to Su Mo just to deal with Pei Huan and make her unhappy. She was not human. Shun Lian chuckled sarcastically. Pei Chi, other than slapping me, what else can you do to me? Can the dead come back to life? Can Su Mo forget the fact that she was gang raped? Can Mingzhu and Pei Huan reconcile? There was a hint of madness in her eyes. All of these hurt you, right? Pei Chi, as long as it hurts you, I will do it. Really? Pei Chi grabbed her hand and pushed her against a big vase behind her. As long as she pressed hard, the vase would fall to the ground, and Shun Lian might be pierced to death by the broken pieces. Shun Lian's face was distorted with fear. Pei Chi, how dare you do this? You don't dare. Is that so? Let's see if I dare or not. Pei Chi quickly pressed her down. When he saw Pei Chi, he was also stunned. He was holding a small bag of fruits in his hand. When the fruits fell to the ground, it was the biggest panic that Can Mingzhu had ever felt in her life. Pei Chi looked at Lao Kin and pursed her lips. She knew that Lao Kin had definitely not bought those fruits for Pei Huan. Even a fool would know who he had bought it for. Suemo was pitiful, but wasn't Pei Huan pitiful too? Since Suemo had been saved, shouldn't she rush back to visit her wife, who had almost miscarried her child? Did she need to stay by her side to give her hope? Pei Chi looked at Lao Kin quietly. She and Lao Kin had always had a good relationship, and they had spent many wonderful and happy times together. But at this moment, because of Pei Huan, she felt like a stranger. Chapter 981. Pei Chi said slowly with disappointment, "If you hadn't met her, would you not have wanted to see her?" Oldkin wiped his face and stared at Pei Chi. "Chi, you know it's not like that. Then what is it?" Pei Chi smiled. "What do you think Pei Huan would have thought? What were you thinking when you abandoned her? Is Suemo more important, or is Pei Huan and the child more important? You and Xiaomei can send Pei Huan home," Oldkin said helplessly. He had never been so weak in his life, and he didn't think that he was lying. He was looking for an excuse. Pei Chi wasn't moved. "You can find her, but can't you call the police?" At that moment, it was his instinct that made him make the final judgment. Old Can's eyes widened like bells, and he stared at Pei Chi. "Even you don't agree with me being with her? On the contrary, I want Pei Huan and the child to have a man to take care of them. But Old Can, your attitude shows that you're backing down. You don't even have any hope after you made a mistake, do you?" Pei Chi's gaze seemed to be able to see through people's hearts. She paused and continued, "I know that I'm being mean to you, because Suemo is also a victim. But Pei Huan might not be able to forgive you." It wasn't just Pei Huan. Oldkin couldn't forgive himself either. After he saved Suemo, she hugged him and cried all the way from the scene to the hospital. She hugged him the whole night and didn't let him leave. Even though she knew that Pei Huan was in the hospital, she didn't let go of him. She was in a state of extreme insecurity. Oldkin felt helpless, and he felt guilty to Pei Huan. Pei Chi was right. Suemo was innocent, but Pei Huan was even more innocent as his wife. The more Suemo pestered him, the more he felt guilty to Pei Huan. Even though he had never wanted to be with Suemo, Oldkin squatted down and picked up the fruit slowly. "Can I go see her?" Pei Chi only felt sad. They were so good before, and they were about to get married. Now he wanted to see Pei Huan, but he had to ask her if she could. "Of course." Pei Chi sounded a little choked up. "Old Can, to be honest, I hope that you can be with her." However, it was wholehearted. Oldkin was also sad. He raised his head and said, "Chi, if I had a second chance, I can't guarantee that I would change my choice." Pei Chi understood and could understand, but from Pei Huan's point of view, she could not forgive him. Lao Can walked into the ward quietly while Pei Chi stood outside. In the white ward, Pei Huan was lying down. Her face was as pale as a piece of white paper. She was only a 23-year-old girl. Lying there at this time, it was as if she had experienced a lifetime. She fell asleep, but she felt uneasy because she kept dreaming of Lao Kansas. She dreamed of him and Suemo standing on the balcony, of him taking off his gown to look for Suemo, and even of them getting married. Suemo came to the wedding and Lao Can and Suemo left. Pei Huan woke up with a start. The moment she opened her eyes, she saw Oldkin standing by the bed, looking disheveled. However, she was not the reason why he looked disheveled. Pei Huan looked at Oldkin quietly, tears welling up in her eyes. If Chi were to see this, she would definitely scold her for being useless. Pei Huan wiped her eyes and said in a choked voice, "Look at you. You've made yourself look like this. Even your eyes are red." Her gentleness and calmness made Old Can feel like dying. Chapter 982. He was tearing up. His heart wasn't rough. The calmer Pei Huan was, the more it meant that he couldn't forgive her. Pei Huan felt the warmth of his large palm and smiled silently. "Old Can, the child is still here. He's still in my tummy." Old Can closed his eyes. "She's staying here too, right?" Pei Huan wiped the tears from the corner of her eyes. She felt that she was very manly at this moment. "You should go back and accompany her. It would be great if she could take a photo and show it to Chi-Chi. Chi-Chi would know that she was strong now." Old Can's entire face was trembling uncontrollably, and his bearded face was contorted. Pei Huan looked at him and reached out to touch his beard. "Old Can, this beard will no longer be mine from now on," he said in a soft voice. He grabbed her hand and closed his eyes. "As long as you're willing, it's still yours. Will it still be mine?" Pei Huan's voice was very soft. "I don't want it if it's incomplete." She tilted her head and looked at him. Now that they met again, she felt resentment but not hatred. After all, Old Can had saved her before. She loved him before, and she still loved him now. It was just that she would rather give it up because it was incomplete. Pei Huan wiped her tears again and turned her head to look at the ceiling. "You can see the child in the future. You're still his father, but it's impossible for us to be together." Although it was difficult, she still managed to say it. Look, it wasn't that difficult. Just saying that made her nose sour again. She felt very sad. Old Can was the same. He stared at her and couldn't say a word for a long time. He had expected it, but he didn't expect Pei Huan to be so resolute. Pei Huan tilted her head and looked at Old Kansas. A beautiful smile appeared on her lips, piercing Old Can's eyes. At that time, he knew that this young lady was strong enough and might not need him in the future. However, he wasn't there when she was in the most pain. What right did he have to ask for her forgiveness? Old Can's heart was in turmoil, and there was a hint of sweetness in his mouth. At this moment, Suamo appeared at the door silently. She was dressed in white like a ghost. Pei Chi-Chi stopped her at the door. "Miss Su, this is Pei Huan's ward." Suamo struggled, but to no avail. She pursed her lips and looked at Lao Kansas Mingzhu. "The doctor wants me to draw blood. I'm scared." At this moment, it was as if Suamo and Pei Huan had been flipped. She had turned into a young lady in her 20s. Pei Chi-Chi saw that Pei Huan's expression was still rather calm. She let go of Suamo and said coldly, "It's good that you made it clear." Suamo looked at Lao Can with a bitter expression. "Mingzhu, I'm not trying to ruin your relationship with Pei Huan. I just want you to spend some time with me." Pei Huan sat up slightly and smiled lightly. "His time will be yours from now on." Sumo's face was as pale as Pei Huan's. She looked straight at Lao Can, hoping that he would take a stand. Suamo had been around for so many years. She was not stupid. She was ruined. Those men had even taken pictures of her, and they had probably leaked out by now. She couldn't have children, and her reputation was ruined. However, she had money. If she and Can Mingzhu fell in love, they could go abroad to a place where no one knew them. She didn't want those people to look at her and guess what was wrong with her body anymore. Suamo admitted that she was selfish, but Can Mingzhu was hers. Pei Huan was in the middle. Chapter 983. Pei Chi-Chi could see the determination in Sumo's eyes. Pei Huan couldn't deal with this woman. She said softly, "Suamo, I know you're a victim this time, but Pei Huan can't take it anymore. If there's anything between you and Old Can, you can settle it privately. I just want to say one thing. Perhaps you feel a lot of pain, but the most painful thing in this world is death. Suamo, you're a woman too. Please understand Pei Huan." Pei Chi-Chi added, "I think Old Can will feel guilty towards Pei Huan if something happens to the child. He won't be with you even if he dies." Suamo was stunned by her words. She had always liked Pei Chi-Chi, but she hadn't expected her to be so direct. She seemed to have seen through her thoughts. Pei Chi-Chi smiled. "As for whether Old Can will be with you in the end, You have to ask him. Suemo, you're a woman too. Don't you think you're hurting Pei Huan by clinging to him like this? Suemo was stunned. She smiled bitterly after a while. Yes, I understand. Pei Chi turned around and looked at Old Kansas. It's up to Old Kan to decide whether he can be with him or not. You can't just provoke Pei Huan and cause her to miscarry the child. Her words were harsh, but they really pierced Sumo's heart. Pei Chi was a young lady who was 100 times better than Pei Huan. With Pei Chi around, it was really difficult for her to take Old Kan away. Pei Huan would have fallen out with Old Kan long ago. Suemo knew that a sad woman was the most pitiful. Pei Chi knew that even better. After a while, Pei Huan looked at Old Kansas. You can leave. I don't have anything to help you with. Old Kan's eyebrows twitched. He really didn't want to leave, but Suemo was there, so he could only leave with her, afraid that he would provoke Pei Huan. However, he didn't realize that he had already provoked Pei Huan by leaving with Suemo. After they left, the door closed. Pei Chi came over and sat on the bed. Pei Huan, don't think too much. Put yourself and your child first, understand? She rarely spoke to Pei Huan in such a gentle manner. To a certain extent, she was comforting Pei Huan. Pei Huan immediately burst into tears. She hugged Pei Chi and said, Chi, is it because I was too bad in the past that I don't deserve happiness? Pei Chi also felt a little sad in her heart and patted her head. Nonsense. It will be better in the future. She could tell that Old Kan was leaning towards Pei Huan, but with Sumo's interference, Pei Huan and Old Kan would definitely fall apart. So, why not let Old Kan figure out what he wanted? Sob, Chi, I feel like a failure. I thought that I had picked up an old man who treated me so well. I was overjoyed and thought that I had found my true love. But I didn't expect that this old man was secondhand. Pei Huan wailed and was extremely sad. Pei Chi could only hug her. Perhaps crying a little was also good. Pei Huan cried so hard that it shook the heaven and earth. Pei Chi did not comfort her. Chapter 984. Pei Chi called her, but Pei Huan cried even louder. Pei Chi felt that Pei Huan didn't need a sister, but a mother. She was like Pei Huan's mother now. Old Kan accompanied Suemo to take her blood and went to the ward with her. Both of them were silent. Suemo had a feeling that Old Kan was going to tell her everything. She sat on the bed and spoke before he could. Mingzhu, you know what I'm thinking, don't you? Old Kan stared at her for a long time and didn't say anything. After a while, he said softly, Yes, Suemo, I know, but I can't promise you. Why? Sumo's voice was full of vulnerability. I know you've always had me in your heart. Old Kan, you asked me if I was willing to be with you last time because I knew I couldn't have children, so I rejected you. But now, I feel that you're the only one who treats me the best in this world. Old Kan was a little annoyed. He looked at Suemo and said, Pei Huan is pregnant. In his heart, there was a softness that stealthily hardened. How could Suemo make such a request when Pei Huan was pregnant? Sumo's face was gloomy. You think I'm dirty, don't you? No. Suemo, I can't bear to leave Pei Huan and the child. He looked at her seriously and said, I'll accompany you until you're discharged. I can even arrange for you to go abroad, but I can't be with you anymore in the future. Suemo looked at the man in front of her as if he was a stranger. After a while, she said dryly, I thought it was your choice to save me. Old Kan smiled bitterly and didn't explain. This kind of thing couldn't be explained. Pei Huan misunderstood, and so did Suemo. At that time, he only thought that Pei Huan had someone by her side, while Suemo was alone. If he was the only one by Pei Huan's side at that time, he wouldn't have left her. But Old Kan wouldn't say that. He looked at Suemo gently like an old friend and said, Suemo, I've fallen in love with Pei Huan. To Suemo, it was undoubtedly the end of the world. However, Old Kan still stayed to take care of Suemo until she was discharged and went abroad. When he returned to B City, Pei Huan had already been discharged from the hospital. He called her cell phone, but it was turned off. He called Xiao Mei's cell phone, and Xiao Mei told him that Pei Huan had moved back to her original place. As for Pei Huan's things at his place, he would have to trouble Mr. Kan to pack them up, and she would pick a day to get them. Little May's tone was particularly polite. She did not shed all pretense of cordiality. On one hand, it was because of her professionalism. On the other hand, Pei Huan had grown up and felt that there was no need to shed all pretense of cordiality with old Kansas. When Lao Can put down his phone, his eyes were empty. He stood under the autumn sun, but he didn't feel a trace of warmth. He returned to the apartment and looked at Pei Huan's clothes in the closet. Row after row, there were so many of them. She would always complain about how much she spent as she dragged back truckloads of clothes. Most of them were pajamas. She liked to wear black lace to tease him at night. Lao Can's rough fingers held the delicate and sexy fabric, and there was a trace of pain on his face. He packed her clothes, but he still left some in his apartment. It took 3 large suitcases to pack, and he drove the off-road vehicle to her villa. It was a European-style building with a market value of about 50 million. Chapter 985. He stared straight ahead. Then, Xiaomei came out and asked the servants to move the things. Xiaomei stayed behind to talk to old Kansas. Pei Huan said that you don't have to look for her anymore. When the child is born, she will inform you to see her. She said that you are the child's father after all. She won't be so cruel. Old Kan's eyes were burning. He felt extremely uncomfortable. But what could he do no matter how uncomfortable he was? His willful little girl was gone. He was the one who killed her. Old Kan stood outside and leaned against the car. He smoked half a pack of cigarettes before leaving. Upstairs, Pei Huan was lying down to protect the baby. Before the child was 6 months old, she had to lie down. It was painful, but she was willing. She loved this child. She loved this child, whether she and Old Kan were together or not. Pei Chi stood in front of the window and watched for a long time. Then, she turned to look at Pei Huan. Have you really decided not to forgive Old Kan? He has been standing outside for a long time. He is so pitiful. Pei Huan did not say anything. She was eating an apple. Recently, Pei Huan had become a pig. Pei Chi looked at her eagerly. She was a little puzzled. She was eating so much, but she did not get fat. Pei Huan finished eating and licked her hands. What's there to be pitiful about? Didn't you go abroad with Suimo a while ago? Pei Chi smiled. Suimo is not coming back, right? She has settled in Canada. Pei Huan said sourly. She only came to see me after she was done with her work. Who cares? Pei Huan was a little angry at first, but she became more serious. Chi, don't try to persuade me. I have made up my mind. She said in a low voice, without him, I will live like a child. Pei Chi did not try to persuade her anymore. She knew that what happened that day was an insurmountable hurdle for Pei Huan. In the afternoon, she returned to the rose garden. Tang Yu was leaning against the living room, reading an English book. What made Pei Chi angry was that Xiao Qi was sitting beside him obediently. That obedient demeanor really resembled her. She kicked the door in dissatisfaction. She was already back. Why did he still keep it? Could it be that it had a special use? Tang Yu heard her voice and looked up at her. Then, he smiled and patted the seat beside him. Come and sit. There was still an hour before dinner. Mr. Tang had a little plan in his mind. Pei Chi stood at the door and didn't move. There's no space there. Tang Yu looked at Seven and smiled. Go play at the side. That little Seven actually knew how to be jealous and just sat there without moving. Pei Chi glanced at Tang Yu with a hint of mockery in her eyes. Tang Yu smiled. Jealous again? He got up and didn't turn off Seven. He walked to Pei Chi and pulled her into his embrace. Lowering his head, he searched for her little mouth and kissed it deeply. These days, because of Pei Huan, he hadn't touched her for 10 days. This kiss was a little out of control. Pei Chi was furious at first, but being kissed like this and his large palm moving into her sweater, she was a little moved. As he kissed, he stumbled onto the sofa. He didn't remove everything and just came directly. Today, Tang Yu was a little rough. He felt like he was hugging a ball of fire, and she didn't need his gentleness. When they were aroused, any words were superfluous. All that was left was possession, sweat, and touching entanglement. Chapter 986. That loud cry made Pei-Chi laugh instead. She kicked Tang Yu's back with her tender little feet, and her little face had a somewhat seductive expression. Tang Yu, your little baby is crying. At that moment, Tang Yu was closing his eyes and enjoying himself. She kicked him with her little feet, and he almost collapsed. He opened his eyes, and there was a meaningful look in his eyes. He grabbed her little hand and pressed her down. When she couldn't control herself, he bit her little ear and whispered in a low voice, "Now you are my little baby." Her little face was so red that it seemed as if blood was dripping out. She bit her lip. He was really shameless. Tang Yu chuckled and carried her whole body to the side of Xiao Qi. In front of Xiao Qi, although the other party was just a robot, Pei-Chi also felt pressure and a sense of shame. She closed her eyes, and her long eyelashes fluttered slightly. She bit her little mouth, and it was extremely seductive. Tang Yu kissed her, laughed in a low voice, and said shameless words in her ear. This relationship, Pei-Chi didn't want to think about it again even if she was beaten to death. That was too shameless. Later, she shut Xiao Qi in the cabinet in the study, and he was not allowed to take it out again. Sitting at the dining table, Mr. Tang touched his chin seriously. "Chi-Chi, if you do this, we will lose a lot of fun." Pei-Chi looked at him, and her eyes were seductive. Tang Yu smiled. At night, he occupied her for a full 3 hours. When he let go of her, both of them were sweaty. Pei-Chi was wrapped in a small blanket, and she lay in Tang Yu's arms like a little beast. She chirped a few times, and her little face covered in sweat was buried in the side of his neck. The two of them were entangled like fishes having fun. She buried her face and said in a muffled voice, "Tang Yu, why do I feel like you're on drugs today?" Her tone was dissatisfied and pitiful. She didn't even have the strength to move her little finger. Tang Yu smiled, lowered his head, and kissed her little mouth for a while. Her whole body went soft in his arms, moaning softly. Her little hands also quietly wrapped around his neck. Tang Yu turned over and covered her. He kissed her little mouth and murmured, "Chi-Chi, why would I need to take any medicine when you're begging me so softly?" She wanted to deny it, but when she looked into his clear eyes, she closed her eyes and moved her slightly swollen lips closer to his. He was drenched in sweat again. After it was over, he carried her to wash up. This time, not only her, but Tang Yu was also almost done. After everything was over, they lay under the blanket together. Pei-Chi couldn't help but think of Pei Huan again, and she couldn't help but feel a little sad. Tang Yu leaned against the headboard and smoked. He only dared to smoke half a cigarette before putting it away. He looked down at the little person in his arms and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" Pei-Chi looked at him. "I'm thinking, will you feel bad when we go to Jean Taiha tomorrow? Will you be like old Can?" Tang Yu pinched her little face with all his might. "Stop talking nonsense. See, you're angry now." Pei-Chi pouted. "I know you can't bear to." Tang Yu smiled bitterly. "This little bastard." "Tang Yu, do you know? I really wanted to kill her that day. She was so cruel to Su Imo and Pei Huan because of personal grudges. It's not a big deal. Is she also this cruel to Tang Xian?" Pei-Chi's voice was a little absent-minded. Tang Xian is her sister, and she watched her grow up. How can she be so cruel? Chapter 987. On Monday, in the conference room of Jean Taiha Company, Pei-Chi, together with Lawyer Chin and Little One Dink, formally announced Shan Zhongshan's will to Shun Lian and the directors of Jean Taiha. Lawyer Chun had a benevolent look on his face. After the announcement, he looked at Shun Lian. "Miss Shin, that's about it. If you have any other ideas, you can bring them up." Shun Lian sneered. "My father has gone crazy. You suddenly got such a so-called will. I think not only me, but the directors of Jean Taiha will also not agree to it." She looked at Pei-Chi and began to slander her. "Moreover, Pei-Chi, you have hidden my father with evil intentions. After all, what you are after is the Shun family's property." She said word by word, "Not only will I not give it to you, but I will also sue you for abducting an old man." Pei-Chi looked at her. It seemed that Shun Lian had been prepared for this. Her expression was calm. If you want to sue, go ahead. But I still advise you not to do that. Otherwise, you probably won't even know how you die. You don't have to worry about it. Shun Lian's pupils shrank. She suddenly remembered that Tang Yu had something on her. She must not sue Xinzhongshan. She looked at Pei Chi with wariness in her eyes. In the end, because of Shun Lian's refusal to cooperate, the judicial department intervened. In the middle of this, Shun Lian operated a little. To put it bluntly, someone from the relevant department coveted Shun Lian's beauty. That person had always been a pervert. He would side with whoever slept with him. There was no one else. After more than a month of evidence collection, it was finally proved that the will was fake. It was forged by Pei Chi. Shun Lian stood on the defendant's stand. Her voice was filled with pride as she looked at Pei Chi. Pei Chi, this world will not change because of you. You can't do whatever you want. The same applies to you, Shun Lian. Pei Chi looked at the prosecutor. I only have one question. Is this signature fake? Is the hospital certificate on it fake too? A certain prosecutor said calmly, the current situation is that the person is no longer conscious. So you said that the person wrote it when he was sober. Then why didn't you take it out earlier? Why wait until now? How many years has it been? Pei Chi chuckled. Then how can we prove that this is real? The person with the highest authority had been yawning for the past few days. His face was cloudy as he looked at Pei Chi with a lecherous smile. If Xinzhongshan wakes up now, he will naturally be able to tell if this is real or fake. Shun Lian was also proud. In this life, Xinzhongshan would never wake up. Pei Chi looked at Shun Lian. Her heart was clear. She had already guessed that Shun Lian probably took off her clothes out of habit. However, was it worth it for this? How would such a debauchee treat her in bed? She could figure it out even with her toes. Really? Pei Chi said softly and firmly, Mr. Xinzhongshan is outside. The doctor approved by the judicial department is also here. He can verify whether Mr. Shun's mental condition is normal. Shun Lian was shocked. The person standing on the top also changed his face. How could this be possible? At this time, the door of the court was opened. The sunlight from outside suddenly shone in, stinging Shun Lian's eyes. Who else could it be but Xinzhongshan, who walked in calmly from outside? Chapter 988. Xinzhongshan slowly walked to the chief inspector. This was his good friend for many years. Now really good. For his own selfish desire, he slept with his daughter on the same bed. Xinzhongshan's old friend slept with his daughter just for his own selfish desire. Being stared at by Xinzhongshan, the chief inspector sighed in his heart. With just one look, he knew that he was normal. Shun Lian was stunned. Her lips trembled and her voice trembled. Dad, how could you? How could you? Xinzhongshan turned his head and looked at Shun Lian. Do you still remember that I'm your father? Shun Lian remembered how she had tortured Xinzhongshan in the past. She bit her lips, but after a while, there was a touch of coldness in her eyes. Why did she need to feel guilty? Xinzhongshan had been acting all along. She stared at him. You knew that Pei Chi needed bone marrow, but you couldn't donate it yourself, so you pretended to be crazy, right? Even Tang Yu didn't know the answer to this question, and so did Pei Chi. Xinzhongshan didn't answer directly. He just said, these are not the most important things. Shun Lian looked at her father. There was no warmth in his eyes, only hostility. Yes, they were enemies now. In his heart, there was only Pei Chi. Shun Lian sneered. It seems that all of you are here today to kill me. She looked up and looked at Pei Chi. So what if you get 20%? I'm still the biggest shareholder of Jin Taihe. As she said this, her eyes fell on Xinzhongshan's face. Dad, you won't even give me this chance, right? She gambled that Xinzhongshan wanted to save his face. Under such an occasion, if Xinzhongshan didn't give her a way out, people would definitely criticize her. But Shun Lian didn't know that face was no longer important to Xinzhongshan. To Xinzhongshan, the most important thing was to train Pei Chi. Therefore, he said indifferently, of course. At this moment, Pei Chi said, Uncle Shen, I refuse Jean Taiha's 20% gift. In her eyes, there was a resolute look, faintly revealing the demeanor of Shun Zhongshan when he was young. Shin Zhongshan admired her and did not stop her. He knew that she had other plans. Shun Lian was stunned for a moment. Then, she cursed in her heart. Pei Chi didn't want it. Is it fun to sue her? She had slept with him for nothing. Shun Lian's face darkened. She glared at Pei Chi. Are you not happy? Pei Chi looked at Shun Lian innocently. I thought you would be very happy. Shun Lian gritted her teeth. Yes, I'm very happy. Then, she looked at Shin Zhongshan and put on a fake smile. Dad, why didn't you inform me that you've recovered? I could have brought you and Mom back to live. Shin Zhongshan rejected indifferently. Your mother and I will live in the place that Tang Yu arranged for us. It's quite good. Shun Lian felt as if she had been slapped in the face. Shin Zhongshan and Pei Chi went out together. Tang Yu was behind them. There was already a large group of reporters waiting outside. It was originally an economic lawsuit. But now that Shin Zhongshan had appeared, the outside world was even more curious about the relationship between Shun Zhongshan and Pei Chi. After all, Jean Taiha's 20% was a big deal. Chapter 989. Pei Chi stood beside Shun Zhongshan, accepting the reporter's crazy photos and questions. Mr. Shun, can you explain your relationship with President Pei? Shin Zhongshan smiled faintly. I've made a lot of mistakes in the past. Chi is my daughter. We've already done a paternity test. Here, I am very grateful to a deceased person, Mr. Pei Mingyi. He taught Chi so well and loved my daughter like a pearl in his palm. Pei Chi was a little moved. Yes, even though Pei Mingyi did not have many good points, he had always been the best father in her heart. The reporters were in an uproar. They had guessed it long ago, but they did not expect Shin Zhongshan to be so frank about such a thing. Pei Chi pursed her lips and stood beside Shin Zhongshan. There were indeed some similarities between their brows. This group photo grabbed all the headlines. People seemed to have forgotten that Shun Zhongshan had a daughter named Shun Lian. Shun Lian kept looking at them, her heart as cold as water. Her father was finally no longer her father. He had woken up and she was terrified. What were they trying to do? When Pei Chi did not make a move, Shun Lian was always in fear, and her judgment was not as good as before. Coupled with her misdeeds in the past few years, she was no longer the capable Shun Lian of the past. Shun Lian sat in her office and smoked while Meng Qingqing stood in front of her desk. She finished a cigarette in frustration, then raised her head and looked at Meng Qingqing. Did you see that? After Boyi merged with Shangyuan, they kept on making big moves. They took down that piece of land in the south of B City and developed it into a large-scale residential area. In a place like B City, even the suburbs were priced at 50,000 yuan. Coupled with the rich and powerful facilities, there was no need to worry about sales. Moreover, it was a school district of a famous school. There was a hint of unwillingness in Shun Lian's eyes. If it wasn't for you stopping me, I would have long gotten my hands on that piece of land. The profit this time around would be at least 10 billion. Meng Qingqing, where's your foresight? Meng Qingqing's lips curled into a cold smile. Do you think Jean Taiha can invest tens of billions at once? The shareholders will not agree. But Boyi was different. His predecessor was Shangyuan. Not to mention tens of billions. He could even invest hundreds of billions. It was just a drop in the ocean. To put it bluntly, Shun Lian did not understand the current situation. Tang Yu had gotten rid of 20% of her worries. With his ability, he could easily play with Jean Taiha. Why did he not make a move now? That was for Pei Chi to practice. Now that Pei Chi was using the monster bow to deal with Jean Taiha, it would be a piece of cake. If it really didn't work out, there was Tang Yu. Of course, in her heart, Shun Lian relied on Meng Qingqing, but she was also suspicious of him. Therefore, his words were mixed with the truth. She couldn't tell what he was talking about. Meng Qingqing sat on the sofa opposite her and swiped a few times with his phone. Then, with a cigarette in one hand, he held up the phone for her to see. Look, this piece of land will be publicly auctioned next month. It can be used to build a seaside villa resort. The place is quite big, but it's cheap. Most importantly, I have insider information that in the next year, Subway Line 3 will be extended here. When it is completed, the opening price will more than double. Chapter 990. Meng Qingcheng seemed to have guessed what she was thinking, so he said calmly, "A piece of land like this is marked at a low price, but if it's bought, the price will double." He looked at Shen Lian. "How about it? Are you interested?" Shen Lian was a little tempted. The most profitable project now was real estate. Everyone was speculating in real estate, and there were many people who wanted to buy it. She and Meng Qingcheng looked at each other for a while, then she stood up. "Sort out the information and give it to me. I need it this afternoon." "Okay." Meng Qingcheng smiled, put his phone into his pocket, and finished the last puff of his cigarette. Just as he was about to leave, Shen Lian stopped him. "Qingcheng, I saw that your phone screensaver is still Tang Xian's photo. I think you are like me, you haven't forgotten the pain." Shen Lian's face was cold. "If you hate them, then let them go to hell." Meng Qingcheng only took a deep look at her and didn't say anything. After he left, Shen Lian smiled sinisterly. "Pei Chi, I want to see how long you can be happy." Now that she had calmed down, she understood it after thinking about it carefully. The reason why Tang Yu had a vasectomy was because Pei Chi couldn't have another child. Her body wouldn't allow her to get pregnant again. Without children, she wanted to see how long Tang Yu's feelings for her could last. On the other side, Pei Chi received a call, and she hung up with She turned her head and looked at Tang Yu, who was sitting on the sofa. She fell for it. Tang Yu smiled. It was not strange. Shen Lian had always been competitive. Seeing Bo Yi's actions, how could she sit still? But the more impatient she was, the more Jean Taihe would be dragged down by her. When that time came, without the support of the shareholders, she couldn't do anything alone. Pei Chi was in a good mood. She tidied up the things on her desk and looked at him. "I want to visit Pei Huan later, and I'm going to Dad's place for dinner. Tang Yu, do you want to go with me?" Tang Yu's gaze was focused on her little face the entire time. She reached out and touched her little face, feeling a little strange. "What's wrong?" He had a faint smile on his face as he slowly said, "Look at this, look at that, and tomorrow you have to look at Xiaoxin. Miss Pei, don't you feel that you have neglected Mr. Tang?" As he spoke, he had already pushed her against the desk and pulled her into his embrace, trapping her. Her waist was very soft, and she leaned back slightly. Her little hand grabbed his tie and pulled him closer to her. She purposely breathed out. "Mr. Tang, I remember that you have a Xiao Qi at home. Why? Are you still not satisfied?" He followed her strength and pressed down, causing her little face to turn red, but she still pretended not to care. "Whether or not Xiao Qi can satisfy me, you know best, don't you?" He nibbled on her little ear, and as he wished, he saw a blush rise behind it. At this moment, they were very close to each other. Their breaths were entwined, and they both let this warmth deepen. Tang Yu couldn't help it. He lowered his head and kissed the side of her face. His voice was a little hoarse. "Chi, do you want to try the lounge here?" Her little hand was still playing with his tie. Her voice was soft, and her expression was innocent. "President Tang, I remember that this is my office, and you are my subordinate. So, you can do whatever you want of me." He blew into her ear. Subordinates should be used to the extreme. That is what a capitalist is. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.